Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe to the channel for regular content on ancient architecture, as well as all of the latest news from the world of archaeology. Nubs or bosses are protrusions that extend out from building stone, and you can find them on many megalithic monuments around the world. And they're one of the most talked about ancient architectural phenomena on the internet today. You can find these bosses on stonework all over the world, from Cusco, Peru all the way to the Pyramids of Giza, even inside the Great Pyramid itself. At Giza, they're most striking on the unfinished granite casing stones of the Khafre Pyramid, but there are also some other great examples on both the Khafre and Khufu Queen's Pyramids. Now, I'm no expert on these stone bosses, and there are a number of independent researchers who have already invested a huge amount of time and work into recording their presence at ancient sites around the world. They vary in terms of size, form and position on the stone blocks, and for a number of years I've always believed they were functional, a practical feature of the stone blocks, left in situ by the quarrymen for the next stage of the work, the movement and construction. Many people are looking for a one-size-fits-all explanation for these stone bosses, and whilst I do think their use is generally related to the stone moving and positioning, the differences in form, size and position on the block may be for a number of different reasons. They were the product of different cultures, who had different technologies and who lived in different eras of history. In my opinion, before comparisons can be made, each specific cultural use of stone nubs needs to be explored in isolation first of all, alongside other anomalies discovered, because whilst I do think most nubs are functional in the construction process, it doesn't mean every single one was. For example, we do find stone bosses protruding out of huge bedrock outcrops and huge blocks with no intention of ever being lifted. So I don't think you can compare these nubs to ones found on smaller stone blocks. To me anyway, these two are completely different, unrelated in terms of function. Anyway, many of you familiar with the nub phenomena know that it is a huge subject, with lots of opinion and hypotheses, and one that you can't comprehensively address in one YouTube video. I'll leave some links in the description below for anyone who wants to delve further into the subject and see a variety of examples, ideas and so on. Because in this video, I only want to share one specific viewpoint on one specific locality and time period, Old Kingdom Egypt. Ideas put forward by Uvo Holscher, a German Egyptologist who lived between 1878 and 1963, and who is most remembered for his work on the Khafre Pyramid and its associated temples. His publication from 1912 is one of the most important documents on the Khafre Pyramid complex, with data, diagrams and details about excavations that took place more than 100 years ago. During his time at Giza, he noted a number of curious features associated with the masonry, such as holes in the pavement floor, gouges and cuts in blocks in particular places, raised bosses or nubs and so on, and his conclusion was that all of them were related to the building process, the moving and raising of the blocks of stone and statues. His work kind of brings all of these things together, offering a logical, straightforward and credible explanation for the anomalies he noted, including why we see features like raised bosses on some stones but not others. Now, to be clear, Holscher's work is not meant to explain the stone nubs at Cusco in Peru. I mean, it could, but as stated, I think specific cultural architecture needs to be studied separately and in depth before any comparisons are made. The Inca and the Old Kingdom Egyptians are massively separated in both time and space. Even if some of the Nubs of Cusco and the bosses of Giza did work in a similar way, well, it's certainly possible that two different cultures worked it out, especially because Holscher's interpretation is not technical. It's a simple way to aid building. So let's get to it. The final parts of Holscher's 1912 publication looks at the movement and placement of stone during the building of the Khafre Pyramid complex. As stated, Holscher noted various features associated with the buildings on the plateau. For example, the sub-pavement of the Khafre mortuary temple was littered with holes, and they were most numerous along the edges of the temple's granite cladding, both at the front and back edges of the granite blocks. He recorded them in plan view on this diagram, and there are hundreds of them, and many are positioned to be half covered with a granite cladding block so that in cross-section it would have looked like this. With the amount of holes noted, and also their specific positioning, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that they must be related to construction. They are there because of the placement of the blocks. On their discovery, Holscher and his German team also noted how each hole was carefully filled in with pieces of stone and gypsum mortar. So, it's like the holes were cut, then the large blocks of granite were laid down, and then the sub-pavement was patched up to hide the holes. At first, Holscher believed there were places where jacks or crowbars had been inserted, but there just wasn't enough space between the granite and the limestone core masonry to undertake such work. In places, the space between the core and the casing was just 80 centimeters in width. In Holscher's opinion, the only credible explanation for these holes is that they were made to allow space for the claws of large tongue-like contraptions to pick up, move and then lay the blocks of granite in place, like this. With the tongues grabbing the chunk of granite at specific measured points on the block, when laying it down, all the workers had to do was aim the claws into the holes and then the block would be in position. And then when the contraption is removed, you just fill in the holes accordingly. Holscher observed three different types of hole groupings in the pavement. First of all, there were pairs of holes positioned opposite one another at the front and rear edges of a cuboid block. Then there are holes located at the front and rear edges of the cuboid, but offset from each other, like this. Then there are holes only found on the front edge, and this was when a casing stone was sat directly next to another block behind. For the first type, Holscher imagined a pair of tongs for each set of opposing holes, the tongs being made of wood, but with claws made of copper at the ends to grip the load. The second type were found in association with very large blocks of stone, like ones found in the Pyramid Temple's statue chambers. The advantage of this arrangement is that you could have the same lifting forces as provided by paired tongs, but far less tongs and claws were required. For example, this picture shows 12 claws being needed for 6 lifting forces. But for the offset arrangement, you only needed 7 claws for 6 lifting forces, so it's more efficient for lifting a large block of stone. The Egyptians knew this oh so well. The downside would be that the contraption, whatever it looked like, would probably be more technical and complex. So, if you've made it this far, you're probably thinking, okay, so what about the Nubs? Well, I'm getting there. What I like about Holscher's work is that he records and explains all the constructional anomalies he came across. Basically, the anomalies including the holes in the ground, gouges and holes cut into the blocks, and also the protruding bosses or nubs, can be explained by the equipment used to build the structures. In this case, the tongue or forceps-like apparatus to lift, move and set the stone in place. At the mortuary temple of the Khafre Pyramid complex, We've just seen how the holes in the ground allowed for the claws of the contraption, and, in places, there was a gap between the limestone core and the granite cladding, and this was to allow room for a person and the equipment. But what about the blocks that did not have a space behind, when they were set right against another block? Large blocks of core masonry and also a number of casing stones were found to have adjacent blocks directly behind. Well, this schematic two-dimensional diagram explains it, and it's based on Holscher's real-life observations and his in-depth study into the Khafre mortuary temple. As we can see, two arms of the contraption could have been parallel to one another, but the height of the claws were offset, holding the underside of the block on one side and the upper side of the block on another, via a gouge or hole that was cut into the block. The block behind was also cut in a specific place, and this was to allow space for the claw. Such features were found in stone and noted by Holscher. Once again, he offers a credible explanation for the anomalies he noted. And this is great for straight cut blocks in the core of the structure, parts that would never be seen when the building was finished. But how would this work when you stack the granite casing stones of the temples, as well as the granite casing on the Khafre Pyramid and the fine limestone casing on the Queen's Pyramids? You need enough space for the claw of the contraption, but you can't have visible gouges in the casing stones. And that's because it's a finishing stone. The outer surface has to look perfect on completion. And that's why we need the stone nubs. Nubs are only present when needed. You don't need one on the lowest course of stone, because you can just cut a hole in the limestone pavement, and this makes space for the claw. But you can't cut a hole in the upper surface of the casing stone to allow for the placement of the block above, because this would ruin the finish. Basically, the claws could not grip the underside of the blocks any higher than the base course, because there was no hole for it to go in. You can't cut a hole in a beautiful finishing stone. The outer surface would look a mess. So, to get around this, you have a boss or nub that sticks out, something that can be gripped by the claw of the tongue-like contraption. That's why the undersides of so many of these bosses are flat. The surface is horizontal, so the stone can be gripped. The rear side of the casing stone was always left rough, simply because nobody would ever see it. We can see this on the Khafre Pyramid's ruined casing. Holes would be gouged out of the rear of the casing stone, and this would allow something for the claw to grip, because again it was rough work and would never be seen. Here's an example of a hole that was cut into a block of granite at the Khafre temple. But what about the space to work in behind the block, to be able to remove the claw once the block is lain? Well, when we have a sloping casing, the core masonry is often stepped, and this was to allow for the equipment. Once removed, the hole remaining could be easily filled in with limestone and lime mortar if required. And once the stones were laid, once a particular construction was finally complete, the outer casing stones would be worked once again to produce a perfect finish, like what we see in places on the sides of the Khafre Pyramid, a pyramid that is of course unfinished, and this is probably because the king died early. The fact that so many structures at Giza were unfinished is what allowed Holscher to present his explanation. So many nubs are still in place. Yes, some of them have been removed, but others certainly haven't. It's also worth noting that the lifting bosses we still see today have eroded greatly. They would have certainly protruded a lot more, like how we see on some ancient Egyptian sarcophagi. Granite is a hard stone, but it does weather and erode. In time, a weathering rind forms on its surface, and this flakes and crumbles, just as we see on many pyramid casing stones. He also points out that not every single block needed the use of the tongue-like contraptions. He said that for some blocks, simple rope loops wrapped around the bosses would be sufficient. It all depends on the size of the block and also where it was being placed. Holscher saw clear evidence of sophisticated apparatus used to build the structures at Giza, and so he makes the point of saying that it was clear the ancient Egyptians were not mere primitive people, and the evidence is there in stone for all to see. Scaffolding holes were also documented at the temple. On average, they were 25 centimeters deep and were cut regularly in identical groups of 12 or 15, each located between two statue holes like this. After the temple was complete, these were also filled in with stones and gypsum mortar. The scaffolding was likely there to support and raise the colossal statues like this, because there is a clear relationship between the statue placements and the sets of scaffolding holes. This isn't a long video, it isn't all-encompassing, and I'm sure somebody can find an example where a lifting boss or nub falls outside of Holscher's explanation, and that is absolutely fine. All of the anomalies related to construction need to be documented at Giza, and then people can come up with a more comprehensive hypothesis and interpretation. But for me, Holscher's work is a superb launchpad, a body of work to build on and expand, and maybe one day we can have a far better understanding of how the Old Kingdom Egyptians built their incredible megalithic structures. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.